Everyone at the airport laughed and pulled out their phones when a black woman was detained with an expired military ID. The crowd whispered and called her a fraud, and the police put handcuffs on her right in front of everyone. But when a general appeared and ordered the cuffs removed, the truth shocked them all. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching this video from. The international terminal thrummed with life, a hive of voices and footsteps echoing off steel beams and glass walls that reached up like the ribs of some enormous beast. The smell of roasted coffee drifted from the cafe near the boarding gates, mingling with the sharper tang of disinfectant and the faint metallic bite of jet fuel that clung to the air. Screens flickered with flight numbers in steady cycles. Boarding calls cut through the background noise, and families herded children toward waiting lounges while business travelers paced with phones pressed to their ears. To most, it was the ordinary chaos of travel, unremarkable in its busyness. But there was one figure in that crowd who did not blend into the faceless rhythm of departure and arrival. A tall, dark-skinned woman in her mid-30s moved with deliberate calm, as though she had mapped every step before setting foot inside the terminal. She wore a weathered coat that had seen better years, the kind of fabric softened by rain and time. Her boots tapped firmly against the polished floor, neither hurried nor slow, but measured like a cadence only she heard. A simple rucksack hung from her shoulder, worn but meticulously organized. And though she appeared unarmed, there was an unmistakable bearing to her stance, the invisible signature of discipline etched into every line of her posture. Her eyes were the detail that drew notice to those who happened to glance long enough. They were not the eyes of a tourist, nor the restless glance of a commuter anxious about delays. They were sharp, observant, fixed yet roaming, cataloging movements, exits, security posts. She absorbed the environment as though the airport were not merely a transit hub, but a battlefield to be surveyed. Few noticed, but those who did often looked away quickly, unsettled without knowing why. When she reached the checkpoint, she stepped forward with the same composure, sliding a hand into her coat and producing an identification card. The security officer accepted it with routine detachment at first, but his eyes narrowed as he read the details. The card was military issue, the kind carried by Navy personnel, but its edges were worn, the lamination peeling in one corner. The expiration date glared in faded ink, expired for 3 years. "Ma'am," the officer said, his tone professional but tightening, "this ID isn't valid. Do you have another form of identification?" The woman's expression remained unchanged. She offered nothing else, only the silence of someone who would not embellish the truth. The guard frowned, glanced at her again, then tapped his radio. "Secondary check required," he muttered, calling over another uniformed officer. Within seconds, 2 more security personnel approached. Passengers behind her in line shifted impatiently, craning their necks to see what the delay was. A child asked his mother why the line had stopped, and she tugged him closer, whispering something that made his eyes widen. The woman did not turn toward the murmurs. She stood upright, her gaze fixed on the officers who now clustered around her. "Step aside, ma'am," one said, gesturing toward the partitioned area where further screenings were conducted. "We need to verify your credentials." She complied without hesitation, moving smoothly to the indicated space. A few in the line exchanged looks. One man chuckled under his breath, pulling out his phone as though the spectacle deserved documentation. Another muttered, "Trying to fake her way through with some old military badge. Pathetic." The officers conferred quietly, comparing the ID with their handheld database. The search produced nothing conclusive. No match to the name in active service, no records of current duty. Suspicion hardened. The oldest among them tapped his radio again, calling in a higher authority. "Military police will take it from here," he announced after a pause, his voice pitched low but firm. "This isn't a standard civilian matter." As the message settled, 2 MPs appeared, their presence drawing a new wave of attention from the crowd. Their uniforms were darker, their demeanor sharper, and the authority they carried seemed to thicken the air. They flanked the woman with efficient precision, one standing at her side, the other just behind. Identification expired. "No supporting documents," the lead security officer explained. "Claims military status. but there's no record in the system. The MPs studied her silently for a beat before one spoke. We'll handle it. His tone held finality, the kind that closed doors and brooked no argument. The woman did not resist as they gestured her forward. She walked with them, her hands relaxed at her sides, her back straight. Around them, passengers parted as though an invisible barrier had formed, whispers rising in her wake. That's what happens when you lie, someone hissed. Caught red-handed. Probably one of those people who buy fake badges online. The whispers swelled into a murmur that followed her down the concourse. She heard them, of course, every syllable, but her stride did not falter. If the words stung, she gave no sign. Her silence was heavier than protest, more unnerving than outrage. It was the silence of someone who had endured greater humiliations than this and survived them all. They reached the glass wall that overlooked the runways, and for a moment she caught her reflection in the panel. Tall, restrained, flanked by authority. The image looked like guilt to an onlooker. To her, it looked like inevitability. The MPs guided her toward a service corridor, away from the curious eyes of the crowd. Yet the impression of their stares lingered, like the echo of a judgment passed without trial. The woman knew this was only the beginning. Whatever was coming next would dig deeper, tear away more layers, and test the patience she had cultivated for years in silence. She inhaled slowly, letting the sterile air of the corridor fill her lungs, and exhaled with the calm of someone bracing for a storm. She did not fight the path they forced upon her. She walked it as though she had walked it before. And as the heavy door closed behind them, sealing her away from the terminal's restless noise, she thought not of the humiliation nor of the anger. She thought only of the truth, buried so deep that even those who held her wrists had no clearance to reach it. The truth that would surface soon, whether anyone was ready or not. The door that shut behind her in the service corridor did not silence the airport. Even through steel and glass, she could still feel the pulse of the terminal, the stares of hundreds of eyes, the weight of whispers that trailed her name, though no one knew it. The military police guided her firmly, their boots echoing in rhythm with hers, the clink of their gear adding a metallic punctuation to the steps. They did not speak to her, nor did she to them. It was as if she had slipped from one world into another, a passage from the chaos of travel to the sterility of confinement, and yet the shame lingered in her bones. They brought her back through another door, out again into the public area near the glass wall of the terminal. Her presence was no longer hidden. Word had traveled quickly, as it always did in places like this, moving faster than footsteps, faster than announcements. A ring of curious passengers had formed, not too close, but close enough to watch. Dozens of phones hovered like small black eyes in the air, recording her every movement. The woman knew what those recordings would look like later. A tall figure, handcuffed, escorted by armed men, her coat hanging loose around her shoulders like a shroud. The MPs did not slow as they guided her forward. Keep moving, one muttered, though she had not resisted. His hand pressed lightly on her arm, the touch neither brutal nor gentle, simply final. She walked with them, each step deliberate, not dragged, not stumbling, though the handcuffs bit into her wrists with each motion. A man in a business suit leaned sideways in his chair as she passed. See? Trying to pretend she's military. They catch people like this all the time, he said to no one in particular, but loud enough that the people around him heard. A young couple glanced at her with a mix of fascination and disdain. The woman shook her head and whispered, "Disgraceful?" From behind, a boy no older than 10 tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Why are they arresting her?" he asked in a voice that carried across the space. His mother bent close, shielding him slightly with her arm. "Because she lied about being a soldier. That's not something you ever lie about." Her explanation was intended for him, but the words stung the air like arrows meant to pierce. The accused woman did not turn to face them. She fixed her eyes straight ahead, on the polished floor that reflected light like a mirror broken into 1,000 pieces. To those watching, her silence looked like guilt. To her, it was survival. One of the MPs stopped her briefly near a pillar where a second group of officers waited. The leader, a man with a square jaw and the stiff shoulders of someone who had spent decades barking orders, stepped forward. He studied her ID card again, his lips pressed into a thin line, then raised his gaze to her face. "You understand you are being detained for impersonating a naval officer," he said in a voice meant to carry, ensuring the crowd could hear as much as she. "This is a federal crime." A murmur ran through the onlookers. Someone whistled softly. Another passenger muttered, "Lock her up." The woman said nothing. Her expression did not waver. Her eyes did not narrow. Her mouth did not twitch. She absorbed his words like a stone absorbs rain, without cracking, without shifting, simply letting it roll over her surface. The officer scowled at her composure, as though he had expected anger or tears, some sign of weakness or protest. Instead, he was met with that silence again, and it unsettled him more than shouting ever could. The MPs resumed their escort, pulling her through the wide terminal. It became a march of humiliation, her figure framed by the glittering advertisements above, the bright signs promising vacations and luxury that contrasted with her reality. Phones followed her every move, lenses zooming in to capture her face. She could feel the eyes, could almost taste their judgment, but inside something in her steadied. Each step felt like a rehearsal of an old memory, an echo of another time she had been paraded, not through an airport, but through places far worse, with enemies instead of strangers. She had learned long ago not to flinch before eyes that wished her shame. A man in line for boarding leaned toward his companion. "You'd think she'd at least try to explain herself," he said, sneering. "If I got caught, I'd be begging." "She's probably guilty," the companion replied. "Look at her. Doesn't even deny it." The soldiers escorting her quickened their pace, perhaps uneasy with the gathering attention, but the crowd was relentless. Like water following a ship's hull, pressing in with whispers and stares. By the time they reached the far end of the terminal, it felt as if the entire airport had turned to witness the spectacle. They turned down another corridor quieter, though even here voices carried. "Fraud!" someone hissed. "Pretending to be a SEAL. Who does she think she is?" The woman inhaled slowly, exhaling through her nose. She could feel the burn of the handcuffs cutting into her skin, the sting of humiliation pricking her nerves, but she refused to bend under it. The only sign of the weight she bore was in the subtle set of her jaw, the barely perceptible tightening around her eyes. Finally, they brought her to a secluded inspection room with glass walls on one side, so passengers passing by could still glance in. The irony was sharp. Even in supposed privacy, she was on display. They sat her in a metal chair, wrists still bound, as one of the officers began speaking into his radio, reporting her detainment. "Civilian female, attempted to use expired military ID. No match in records. Currently in custody pending further verification." His words were meant for the radio, but they filled the room with the heavy cadence of accusation. Through the glass, she caught sight of more people stopping to stare, their faces pressed near, like spectators at an exhibit. A woman in a red coat pointed directly at her, speaking animatedly to the man beside her. A group of teenagers laughed openly, mimicking the gesture of handcuffs around their own wrists before snapping pictures. Her lips parted slightly as she drew in a breath, but she made no sound. The humiliation was thick, suffocating, but she let it wash over her without giving her captors or her audience the satisfaction of reaction. The commanding officer stepped closer, folding his arms across his chest. "Why don't you just admit it?" he said, his voice edged with impatience. "You thought you could walk through here, wave around a fake ID, maybe get some attention. Well, congratulations, you got it. Again." She remained silent, and his frustration deepened. "People like you disgrace the uniform, pretending to be one of us. You insult every man and woman who has actually served." At those words, something flickered in her eyes. Not anger, not fear, but a faint, quiet grief. It was gone in an instant, buried beneath the stillness of her face, but it had been there long enough that one of the younger MPs noticed. He blinked, shifting uncomfortably, as though questioning whether the story was as simple as it appeared. The officer didn't notice. He turned away, muttering, "You'll have plenty of time to think about your little stunt when you're in a cell." The woman sat, hands bound, surrounded by glass, surrounded by judgment. She had been made into a spectacle, her dignity stripped in the eyes of the crowd. And yet, beneath the surface, beneath the humiliation that pressed down on her shoulders, something else pulsed quietly. Resolve. This was not the end. This was only the path she had known she would one day walk. As the officers prepared to transfer her deeper into the restricted area, past the point of public view, she lifted her head slightly, her gaze steady on the corridor beyond. If anyone watching expected shame, they saw instead the posture of a woman who had already survived worse storms than their contempt. And as the MPs moved her forward once more, the echo of her footsteps carried through the hall, not like those of a criminal, but of someone moving steadily toward a truth that could not be hidden forever. The long corridor swallowed her footsteps as the MPs escorted her deeper into the restricted section of the airport, away from the glass walls and gawking faces. The echo of jeers and whispers still clung to her, a residue that no steel door could truly shut out. But as the noise of the public terminal faded behind layers of reinforced walls, what replaced it was silence, thick, oppressive, and heavy with intent. It was the kind of silence that never lasted, because soon enough it would be filled with accusations, questions, demands, and the slow grind of bureaucratic judgment. The inspection room they led her into had no windows, no distractions, only a single steel table bolted to the floor, two metal chairs facing each other, and a faint odor of disinfectant mixed with the metallic tang of old air conditioning. The fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting a pallid glow that flattened her features, making the brown of her skin appear ashen, her eyes deep wells of shadow. The MPs directed her into the chair without ceremony, their hands guiding her down with quiet authority, though she had not resisted once. Her wrists remained in cuffs, the steel edges cutting shallow grooves into her skin. A man entered moments later, not in fatigues but in a crisp uniform shirt with insignia that marked him as an officer of rank, though not of the highest. His expression was one of professional suspicion, the kind worn by men who had spent years behind desks ensuring rules were obeyed and papers matched signatures. He carried a thin file, though she doubted it contained anything more than the sparse details collected so far. Expired military ID, attempted use of credentials to access restricted areas, suspect female, no supporting records. To him, that was already enough. He sat opposite her, set the file on the table, and folded his hands. For a long moment, he simply studied her, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to gauge whether she would crack under silence. She did not. Her posture was straight, her gaze fixed on him, but not confrontational. It was the gaze of someone who had learned patience not in classrooms, but in places where silence was survival. "State your name," he said at last. She looked at him, her lips parting slightly, but no sound emerged. He waited, his brows knitting. "You do understand the position you're in, don't you? You've presented a falsified military identification at a federal checkpoint. That's impersonation of an officer, a serious federal crime." Her eyes flickered briefly to the file in front of him, then back to his face. Her silence was not ignorance, it was choice. He opened the file, as if to underscore his words with official weight. "According to this," he said, flipping through the pages, "you are claiming to be a Navy officer. More than that, a SEAL, if the insignia on that ID is to be believed. Do you know how many women have ever been on the SEAL rosters for the years listed here?" He leaned forward, lowering his voice as though delivering a devastating truth. "None. Not one. Your little story collapses under the simplest check." Her hands shifted slightly in the cuffs, the faint rattle of metal the only sound she offered in response. He frowned, tapping the table with a finger. "You see, we get people like you more often than you'd think. Pretenders. They memorize some jargon, maybe read a few books, sometimes even pay to have fake tattoos etched into their skin. They think they can waltz through security, flash a badge, maybe impress someone at a bar with tall tales. But here, you're just another fraud. And I'll be honest with you, you're not even particularly clever at it. An expired card? Really?" He expected her to shrink under the derision, to stammer, to protest. Instead, she remained unmoved, her eyes steady, her lips pressed into a calm line. That composure unnerved him. He sat back in his chair, blowing out a breath. You've got nothing to say, do you? Fine. Then let me tell you what's going to happen. In a few minutes, you'll be transferred to federal custody. They'll run your prints, scour every database. They'll confirm what I already know, that you never served a day in the Navy, let alone in special operations. And then you'll face charges. People like you think they can slip through the cracks, but trust me, you're not the first, and you won't be the last. They all end up the same way. A younger MP standing near the door shifted uncomfortably at the certainty in the officer's voice. He glanced at the woman's face and, for a fleeting second, thought he saw something there, not guilt, not fear, but a shadow of grief that ran deeper than anything words could express. It unsettled him, but he looked away quickly, not willing to break ranks. The officer continued, his tone sharpening. You insult every man and woman who has worn the uniform by pretending to be one of us. People have bled for those tridents you pretend to carry, and you think you can just stroll in here, wave a card, and claim that honor? Not on my watch. Her head tilted just slightly, her eyes narrowing a fraction. For the briefest instant, the air between them shifted. He could not explain it, but it was as though a storm cloud had passed over the room, silent yet crackling with invisible electricity. It was gone almost as quickly, and she sat again in stillness. But the impression lingered, leaving him oddly unsettled. He closed the file with finality. Enough. You'll have your chance to explain yourself to the feds. Until then, you're under arrest for impersonating a naval officer. Do you understand? Still no answer. The silence stretched, heavier now, pressing against the walls, pressing against the officer's patience. Finally, he gestured to the MPs. Take her. The van will be here shortly. They moved toward her, one of them pulling her to her feet, the cuffs rattling against the steel table as she rose. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the one-way mirror on the wall, the dark pane behind which she knew others were watching. For the first time, her lips parted, and though no words left her mouth, the faintest trace of a smile touched her face. It was not the smile of someone beaten, nor of someone amused. It was the knowing smile of someone who understood that what came next was beyond the control of the men in this room. The officer caught the gesture and frowned. What's so funny? He asked sharply. She offered no reply. The MPs began leading her toward the door, their grip firm, their pace brisk. The room seemed to shrink around them, the sterile walls closing in, the fluorescent lights buzzing louder as if in protest. Outside, the corridor waited, cold and endless, leading her toward the next phase of this ordeal. And then the door opened. The sound of hinges turning was unremarkable, yet it cut through the air like the crack of a gunshot. Every head turned. The MPs froze mid-step. The officer stiffened, his mouth half open with a reprimand that died in his throat. A man entered. His presence filled the space before a word was spoken. His uniform was immaculate, his shoulders broad, his medals and ribbons a cascade of history pinned to his chest. The lines of his face spoke of decades of command, of decisions that had weighed lives in their balance. His gaze was sharp, unyielding, and when it settled on the woman in cuffs, the atmosphere in the room changed entirely. The officer shot to his feet, snapping to attention. The MPs stiffened, their grips tightening instinctively, though uncertain why. The man did not look at them. His eyes never left the woman. For the first time since the airport, something like recognition flickered in her gaze. Not relief, not surprise, but acknowledgement, as if she had expected this moment, as if his arrival had been written into the pattern of inevitability she had accepted hours ago. The officer cleared his throat, beginning to speak. Sir, this woman? The man raised a hand, silencing him without a word. Then in a voice calm but carrying the weight of command, he said, Remove the cuffs. The room froze. And in that frozen moment, humiliation gave way to the edge of revelation. The air inside the interrogation room seemed to thicken the moment the man entered. The fluorescent hum above did not change, nor did the sterile smell of bleach and steel, but the atmosphere shifted as if the walls themselves straightened to attention. His boots struck the floor with deliberate weight, and every man in uniform felt the pull of his presence before he spoke a word. Authority radiated from him not as bluster, not as a demand, but as the kind of gravity forged only in decades of command. The officer, who had moments ago been so certain of his control, found himself instinctively standing, his spine rigid, his hand rising in a salute that was both precise and hurried. The MPs, who had frozen in place, still held the woman by her arms, but the certainty of their grip faltered. They were soldiers, trained to obey the chain of command, and the man who now stood in the doorway was the embodiment of that chain. He was a general, though not one who belonged behind a desk. His presence was sharper than metals, heavier than the polished bars on his chest. He had the look of a man who had carried orders into places so dark that paper could never record them, who had shouldered victories that could never be celebrated, and losses that had to be buried. His hair was graying at the temples, cut short, his jaw set in a way that left no room for doubt. The general's gaze never wavered from the woman in cuffs. She returned it with quiet steadiness, her dark eyes meeting his as if the others in the room did not exist. It was not defiance, nor was it submission. It was recognition. A silent exchange layered with history invisible to anyone else present. "Remove the cuffs," the general said. His voice was not loud, not a barked command, but it carried such weight that it made every other sound in the room seem to retreat. The officer blinked, his mouth opening and closing once before words stumbled out. "Sir, with respect, this woman is under arrest for impersonating—" The general's eyes snapped to him. "I gave you an order, Captain. Remove the cuffs." The steel in that tone left no room for hesitation. One of the MPs quickly stepped forward, fumbling with the key, the small clicks of metal against metal echoing in the taut silence. The handcuffs opened, falling away from the woman's wrists with a muted clatter against the table. She rubbed her wrists slowly, her movements measured, deliberate, as though the act of freedom was both familiar and foreign. The officer looked bewildered, glancing from the general to the woman and back again. His entire argument, his entire posture of authority, had collapsed in the span of seconds. "Sir, with all due respect, we ran her through every database. There is no record of her service. There is no female SEAL listed in those years. She has nothing that you can see," the general interrupted, his tone quiet but edged with finality. He turned his gaze back to the woman, and for the first time there was something softer there. Not gentleness exactly, but gravity shaded with respect. "Show me," he said. She did not ask what he meant. Her hands now free moved to her sleeve. Slowly, with the deliberation of someone unveiling a truth too long hidden, she rolled up the fabric to her shoulder. The light caught her skin, and then it caught the ink. The room inhaled as one. Etched into the curve of her shoulder was a tattoo that none of the men in that room had ever seen in person, but all instinctively knew was forbidden to forge. It was not the standard Navy SEAL trident, not the emblem that adorned plaques and graduation certificates. It was a variation so specific, so shrouded, that it was known only to a handful of people within the highest circles of command. Its lines were sharp yet intricate, carrying the weight of a secret history. To those who recognized it, the sight alone was confirmation more binding than any document. The younger MP closest to her stepped back as if burned. The officer's jaw slackened. His certainty collapsed into confusion, then into fear. The general studied the tattoo for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion but in memory. He had seen that mark before, years ago, in circumstances never written, in missions never spoken of outside secure rooms. His chest rose and fell once, a deep breath that steadied something inside him. "That tattoo," he said at last, his voice quiet but absolute, "is authentic." The officer shook his head as if trying to clear it. "Sir, that's not possible. We checked every roster, every classified annex available to our clearance. There's nothing." "Of course there's nothing," the general snapped, turning his gaze on him again. "That was the point. Project Sentinel was never meant to leave a trace. Not in your databases, not in your reports. What you've been looking for doesn't exist to you." The officer faltered, his words tangled in his throat. "Project what?" The general ignored him. His attention returned fully to the woman. "When you enlisted, you weren't Alexandra Hale. You weren't even a lieutenant. You were Alex, A 19-year-old with no future except what you carved for yourself. And you carved deeper than anyone expected. The room fell into stunned silence. The MPs shifted uneasily, their certainty gone. The officer, his authority broken, sank slowly into his chair, staring at the tattoo as if it might explain itself. The woman let her sleeve fall back into place. Her expression had not changed. She did not thank the general, did not protest, did not even acknowledge the vindication. It was as though she had expected nothing less than this exact moment, as though humiliation had been only another checkpoint on the path she knew she had to walk. The general exhaled, rubbing a hand briefly across his temple. The weight of years pressed down on him, years of secrets and silence. Then he lowered his hand and spoke, his voice steady once more. "Gentlemen, what stands before you is no fraud. She is who she says she is. And if you knew what she had endured, you'd be saluting her instead of shackling her." The younger MP shifted again, his face pale. The officer muttered almost under his breath, "But why now? Why here?" The general didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained locked with the woman's, a wordless conversation passing between them. Finally he spoke, though his words seemed directed more to her than to anyone else. Because the past never stays buried forever. The woman's silence lingered, but this time it felt less like refusal and more like agreement. The room remained heavy with shock, the air charged with the gravity of what had just been revealed. The officers who had condemned her only minutes before now stood adrift, their certainty shattered, their authority dwarfed by the general's quiet conviction. And yet none of them could shake the feeling that what had been unveiled was only the beginning, that the tattoo on her shoulder was not just proof of identity, but a signal of something deeper, something stirring beneath the surface of the present. The general stepped back toward the door, then paused, his eyes still locked on hers. "We'll speak privately," he said. "There's more here than they can understand." And as he turned, gesturing for her to follow, the MPs instinctively moved aside. No one stopped her now, no one dared. The door closed behind them with a final, echoing thud, and the humiliation that had once defined the day dissolved into something else entirely. It had been replaced by revelation, by a truth heavy enough to bend the air, a truth that promised this story was far from over. The woman walked beside the general without speaking, her steps as steady as they had been since she first entered the terminal. She did not need to ask where they were going. She already knew. And somewhere in the sterile corridors of the airport, beneath the buzz of fluorescent lights and the endless drone of announcements, the first whispers of a buried past began to rise again. The corridor that stretched beyond the interrogation room seemed impossibly long, as if the sterile walls themselves conspired to contain secrets too heavy for daylight. The general walked in silence, his stride purposeful, the rhythm of his boots steady against the linoleum floor. Beside him, the woman matched his pace without hesitation, her expression unchanged from the moment she had left the steel chair behind. The echoes of humiliation still lingered in the walls of her memory, but they no longer pressed against her like chains. What replaced them now was the weight of recognition, the knowledge that one man in this building had looked upon her and seen not a fraud, but the truth carved into her very skin. At the end of the hall, the general paused, swiping a key card through a locked panel. The heavy door released with a dull, mechanical click, swinging inward to reveal a smaller, more private briefing room. Unlike the interrogation chamber, this space bore signs of comfort leather chairs, a muted carpet, walls lined with soundproofing panels. It was meant for conversations behind closed doors, discussions that never found their way into official transcripts. The general motioned for her to enter first, then closed the door behind them, sealing them off from the curious eyes that had followed her through the airport. For a moment, the two stood in silence. The general regarded her carefully, as if reacquainting himself with a ghost long thought buried. She met his gaze without wavering, her composure as unwavering as it had been throughout every step of the ordeal. Finally, he broke the silence. "I thought you were gone," he said, his voice low, carrying a note of something rarely heard from him. Sorrow. When the reports came back from that mission, there was nothing left to doubt. They told us you had fallen, that nothing could have survived. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but her eyes betrayed nothing. They told you what they needed you to believe, she replied quietly. It was cleaner that way, easier to bury what couldn't be acknowledged. The general exhaled heavily and moved to one of the chairs, lowering himself into it with the air of a man who had borne too much weight for too long. Project Sentinel was always a gamble, he admitted, his tone threaded with regret. We knew the world wasn't ready to see what we were testing, what we were creating, pulling recruits from outside the mold, tearing apart every barrier to see if the human spirit could endure where rules said it shouldn't. You proved it could, but when the mission collapsed, when bodies were lost, it was easier to erase the whole program than to admit its cost. She sat opposite him, her posture erect, hands folded loosely on the table between them. Her face remained calm, but behind her stillness was a storm he could almost feel. You erased more than a program, she said. You erased names, faces, entire lives. You turned us into shadows because it suited the story. The general nodded slowly, his eyes closing for a brief moment before he looked at her again. And you carried that silence alone, all these years. Her gaze flicked away for the first time, settling on the wall, as though it might offer some measure of relief from the memories pressing at the edge of her mind. Alone was the only option. I woke in a hospital under an assumed name, patched up and told to disappear. They stripped me of everything but the scars. I obeyed because fighting would have killed more than just me. But the silence has teeth, General. It devours piece by piece until there's nothing left of who you were. The words settled between them with a finality neither could deny. The general leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his voice steady but laced with conviction. You survived. That's more than anyone could have asked. But your return now, it cannot be chance. Why come back after all this time? Why now? She met his eyes again, and for the first time since the cuffs had been removed, her composure cracked just slightly, revealing the ember of urgency burning beneath. Because one of ours never died that night, she said. You signed off on the report that confirmed it, but the report was wrong. The general's expression hardened, disbelief flickering across his face. That's not possible, we confirmed. You confirmed what they told you to confirm, she interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut through the quiet. I've spent years tracking whispers, following the fragments others ignored. He's alive, captured, and he has knowledge locked inside him that cannot fall into enemy hands. If we don't act soon, if we let this window close, not only will he die, but everything he carries will die with him, or worse, be turned against us. Silence fell again, heavier than before. The general's eyes narrowed as he studied her, weighing the truth in her words against the cost of believing them. She did not flinch, did not soften her claim with plea or explanation. She simply waited, the same patience she had carried through the humiliation of the crowd now anchored in the urgency of her mission. At last, the general leaned back, his hands clasping together. You realize what you're asking, he said. An unsanctioned operation, men pulled from shadows, ordered to act without acknowledgement, without protection. If this goes wrong, careers end, reputations shatter, entire commands fall, and even if it goes right, it cannot be spoken of. She inclined her head slightly, a faint shadow of a smile ghosting across her lips. It wouldn't be the first time, would it? The general let out a breath that was half a sigh, half a laugh devoid of humor. No, it wouldn't. He rose from his chair, moving to the cabinet along the wall. From it, he retrieved a small box, plain and unmarked, its weight evident even before he set it down before her. This was meant for another time, he said. Perhaps never. But if we are to do this, if you are to do this, it is only right. She opened the box slowly. Inside lay a golden trident pin, gleaming softly under the muted light. Unlike the counterfeit symbols mocked in training sessions, this one was real heavy with meaning, forged not just from metal but from blood and sacrifice. Her fingers brushed it, and for the first time her eyes shifted, not with tears but with the weight of something long denied. No records, the general said. No ceremonies, no papers. But this says what the world never could. You earned it long ago. Now take it, because we have work to do. She closed the box carefully, her grip firm around it. Rising to her feet, she met his gaze squarely. Then let's begin. Every second we waste, he slips further away. The general gave a single nod. He opened the door and gestured for her to follow. The hallway beyond no longer seemed sterile or oppressive. It was simply the path ahead, the next step in a story that had refused to die. As they walked together into the silence of the restricted wing, the woman felt the weight of the trident in her hand and the shadow of her erased past settling back into her shoulders. She was not Alexandra Hale, not a civilian imposter paraded before strangers for their mockery. She was what she had always been, a soldier forged in secrecy, a survivor carrying truths too dangerous for the light. And though the world might never know her name, those who mattered would remember. The shadow had returned, and with her return, the balance of silence and truth had shifted. The storm was no longer coming. It had already begun. If this story kept you hooked, don't stop here. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next twist. Check out our other videos packed with unbelievable true-style stories you won't believe until you see them. And if this one blew your mind, share it with your friends. Let them get caught up in the shock too.